So, good day, everyone, and welcome to this our webinar here at Hugbúnaðarsetrið. I'm really pleased to run this webinar because I think me and Adam, we met in New York during PDN Photo Expo when I was invited there by Adobe back in 2010. We connected and we met there later, you know, probably for 2 or 3 years until I started cheating and going to Adobe Max in California instead of attending the PDN Expo. I'm not going to say much. You have read about what on the website, on the webinar page, and I'm going to share the screen with the one and only Adam Stoltman. I think, you know, this is going to be. This is not about technology. This is much, much more. So listen carefully, okay? I'm gonna share screen, and I need to allow a couple of people in there in this and joined and make host.
Okay. Okay. Do I?
You accept?
Am I set? Should I?
And you share screen.
And I share screen. Great, got it.
And I mute myself.
Oh, it says
just before in the chat box, guys. Please at the bottom, please write in English short questions to Adam, which we can.
Yeah. Okay. Am I driving, Einar? I'm the host.
Yeah, you're the host.
Can you see this slide? Can you see the title slide? Everybody? Hello?
Yes, you.
Were you able to see that title slide?
No, we don't see it.
You don't see it. Okay, so I have to share screen. Okay, hold on. Here we go. All right, and let's see. How about now?
Fine.
There you go.
You got it? You can see that?
Yep,
Yeah.
fine.
Okay, great.
Brilliant.
So first of all, hello and good morning from New York. I realize it's the afternoon in Iceland. It's really a pleasure to talk to this group. Einar and I connected over 10 years ago, as he mentioned, and there's some people you feel an immediate kinship with, and Einar was one of those people. We just sort of found we spoke the same language creatively. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit today about sports photography and my evolution in the business. I've worn a few different hats over the years. I began my career as a sports photographer in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I've covered 12 Olympics. I was the sports picture editor at the New York Times. I was an editor at the New York Times Sunday magazine. And I was in charge of feature photography at Sports Illustrated for many years. So in those different capacities, I've developed a bit of perspective on producing sports imagery, and certainly have my own ethos as a photographer. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. As I mentioned, I began my career in the, why is this not going? Yeah, here we go. In the early 1980s, this is Björn Borg at Wimbledon, winning his 5th Wimbledon. This picture was taken just at the end of the match. Obviously in sports, when we're documenting sports, the moment of victory is always considered, you know, one of the most dramatic moments, and sports photographers are always in eager anticipation of this moment. This picture was shot in film back in the days when we shot film. I think it was shot on a 400mm lens, and obviously in sports you're at a great distance from the action usually, so we tend to use very long telephoto lenses. I actually got in a great deal of trouble for taking this picture. I was on assignment for the Associated Press. I was what was known as a stringer photographer for the AP then. And at that time, news photos were produced in black and white. So you shot on black and white film. The film was processed. We had a darkroom set up under center court. You'd quickly make a print, you'd put it on a wire machine, and off it would go. And the final was on a Sunday. And I was 20 years old, and I thought this was such an earth-shattering event, Bjorn Borg winning his 5th Wimbledon title, that of course it had to be documented in color, against the wishes of my editor, who felt that it needed to be documented in black and white. So when they found out that I had the best angle, because we had 3 or 4 other photographers there, everybody was very upset with me that I shot it on color. We had to open a lab in London to process the film on a Sunday, which was a big and expensive undertaking. And then we were able to get a chrome, and then from there a black and white print was made, which went out on the wire late. But the color picture actually wound up getting used an awful lot. So all was eventually forgiven, but it's interesting to note, because of the evolution of the technology of the time. I mean, to think now in terms of, well, you have to process the film, you have to open the lab, you have to make a conversion negative, you have to make a black and white print. It's in the age of digital, it's hard to imagine that things were ever that way, but indeed they were. So it was a historic match, and you could sense all the exultation and the triumph in Borg's face, and the relief that he'd finally achieved this incredible achievement. Following year, why is this not? There we go. Oh, just click. The following year, McEnroe, who was his rival at the time, was able to overcome Borg. McEnroe won his first Wimbledon, and nearly in the same spot, slightly different area in center court. He exulted in this moment of triumph. For McEnroe, chasing Bjorn Borg was his greatest motivation, and he always played his best against Borg. There were few other players that he would not act up against, because he had a bit of a temper. But Borg was McEnroe needed that rivalry to push him to play his best. So this was the following year. Boris Becker, who was just sentenced to 2.5 years in jail for violating his bankruptcy agreement. But at that time, he was 17 years old. This is him winning his first Wimbledon. I think this is 1985. And he was known for leaping about the court. Up until that time, nobody had ever seen anyone play with this kind of abandon. And so this is one of those moments where he threw himself across the court in an attempt to get a backhand volley. And again, you're in sports photography, you're always looking to kind of freeze that moment of suspended animation. I like to think of it as it's a aha moment where your breath is taken away for a second. Billie Jean King, this is her in the twilight of her career. I think this is probably in 1983 at Wimbledon. And so through the early 1980s, I was developing my craft as a sports photographer, and covering the tennis circuit was a big part of that for me. I was a stringer for the AP with a specialty in tennis. So they would every year fly me over to the French Open to shoot that tournament, then to Wimbledon. Sometimes I would stay and do the British Open golf, and then in the fall I'd do the US Open tennis. And that was really how I got my start as a photographer. What's interesting about this photograph is you may notice her eyes are keenly focused on the ball. When you're photographing sports, the eyes are also often tells about an athlete's concentration level, about their focus level, about their intensity. If you watch their eyes, you can often read what is going to happen next. And so you can see her eyes intently focused on the ball. And I think that's one of the things that helps make this image. Jimmy Connors, also in the 1980s at Wimbledon, lunging for a backhand volley. In sports photography, we often talk about peak action, peak moments. It's that moment when the body is fully extended, where the action has reached its apex. The body can't extend anymore in that direction. And it may be a different different, maybe slightly different in different sports, but the principle is the same. You know, whether a basketball player is going up for a jump shot, or a tennis player is lunging for a backhand, or a shortstop is diving for a ball, or I understand handball is very popular in Iceland. If a handball player goes up, you know, for a shot, there's a moment where their body has reached its maximum extension, and one of the things sports photographers do is they look for those moments of suspended action when you know, things have reached their peak moment. So this is one of those moments with Jimmy Connors. John McEnroe serving on center court. Here, very long telephoto lens looking directly towards the action. And that helps give it some of that intensity. So tennis in the 1980s was a very exciting sport. It was very dynamic, a lot of personalities, and it was a precursor of the big game that the sport has become now. And it was very exciting to be around that. I was very young then. I started in the late 70s when I was about 17, and you know, through the early 80s, I was in my early 20s. And at that time, there was a roving band of journalists and photographers that would travel the sports circuit. And I was sort of brought under the wing of several people and taught about life on the road, and you know, how to find your way as a roving photographer and journalist. Some covers from the 1980s: Gabriela Sabatini. That's also at Wimbledon. Yannick Noah, French player, during the French Open in 1983, which was the year he wanted. Again, moments of full body extension, not dissimilar from dance, you know, where you're looking for those moments of extension, heightened moments. Very different sport, very different look. This is Michael Phelps at the 2012 Olympics in London. This is the butterfly, and this was shot on a very long lens. It was 600 millimeter with a converter, so with 800 millimeter lens. And I was in a slightly elevated position. When watching Phelps swim in the butterfly, it was really like watching a submarine, you know, explode from the water. There's that much power and intensity. And I was looking for a way to kind of convey that. And the expression on his face as he's drawing in a massive breath, because when they emerge from the water, they take in oxygen. And he's about to fling his arms forward. The water is sheathing his body. It's gonna, you know, as he brings his arms forward, it's gonna fall away. But this was that moment I was looking for, that moment of emerging, you know, from beneath the surface of the water. Sometimes sports can be quite moody and quite quiet. You know, this is an early morning workout at Belmont Park, which is a racetrack in New York. And this was a practice rider just out breezing the horse at, you know, 6 in the morning. The sun was just coming up. There was mist on the track. There's sort of a quiet discipline to sports. You know, we tend to, on television or in competition, see the culmination of years and years of discipline and practice and training. We see the big moments, but a lot of the athletic discipline is indeed quite lonely and quite solitary. And so I was trying to get at some of those feelings, you know, in this photograph, because this is a ritual that goes on every morning at every racetrack around the world. And I think that in approaching photographing sports or any subject, you know, it's very important to feel an emotional connection with the subject matter. I've always been attracted in sports to the idea of the hero's journey. That you know, what I see in sports is I see a sole individual or team against great odds, tackling great things. And so visually that often translates to a very small subject in the frame and a very large vista, a larger frame. But that theme resonates for me personally, and so my images tend to reflect that kind of idea. Similar idea here. This was actually on this is a sailboat race during the Pan Am Games in 1987. I was on Lake Michigan on a boat, photographing a race that was much closer to me. And all of a sudden, a storm rolled in, and the boat started heaving and pitching, and the horizon line was going up and down and up and down. And I looked behind me, and sailors were actually being fished out of the water because their boats were capsizing. There were helicopters circling overhead. But then I looked way off in the distance, and there were far, far away on another race course, there were two other sailboats, spinnakers flying, in another race. And because the sky was so dark, the spinnakers had an almost translucent quality to them. And I was just so struck by that. It had such a grand vista look to it. And so I tried to take a picture. Unfortunately, the boat was heaving so much that, nearly every picture I took, the horizon line was either way up to the left or way up to the right. And this was the one frame where the horizon line was relatively steady. And I've always liked this picture. It also speaks to me about equilibrium and balance, which is also a very important part of sports and athletics, finding that balance. It's a diver in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Again, this is I think a late evening training session. And again, trying to get at this idea of the lonely discipline of the sport. I was shooting from below the board, using the sky as a background, silhouetting the form, again, so we can see the athletic form in motion and freeze it. Also, the London Olympics. This is a Chinese diver, and looking at just the beauty of the form set against the water, using a clean background. A lot of times when you photograph sports, you are at the mercy of backgrounds, but the extent to which you can separate your subject by using a clean background, the form will tend to be more dramatic. Sometimes you can do that with just a long lens and blow the background out of focus. In this instance, from shooting in an elevated position, I was able to use the pool water as the background and help frame the subject. There's a certain grace to sports like diving and gymnastics, not dissimilar to ballet perhaps, but again, my eye tends to be drawn to those kinds of themes. This is, speaking of gymnastics, this is Gabby Douglas, who's the gold medalist at the London Olympics in 2012, and talk about composure, talk about discipline and grace under pressure. She's inverted. Her eyes are intently focused on the beam. She knows exactly where she is in her movement. Legs and body are fully extended in the inverted position. And, to me, this image, speaks a lot about concentration, focus, discipline, orientation, balance. Obviously, we work at fast shutter speeds when we're photographing sports. General rule of thumb, 1/500th of a second or above. For freezing the action, 1/250th of a second or greater if the action is coming towards you. Similar idea, different angle. This is the silver medalist, I think, at the London Olympics. And again, just by using the framing of the mat, I rather like this composition, which has a certain grace and elegance to it. American baseball is a very slow sport. You can go inning after inning after inning where nothing happens. And there's a real workmanlike quality to baseball. It's like men at work, every inning they go out into the field, and they come back, they bat. And there's a very slow cadence to the game. When there's action, when somebody steals base or hits a home run, yes, there's a lot of excitement. But most of baseball is this very kind of day in, day out, workmanlike routine. And so I was trying to come up with a picture that reflected that. And I was watching the comings and goings of the dugout. And so I had the idea to put the camera very low and waited. I probably waited about 4 or 5 innings for everyone to line up properly so that we could get this, this kind of a composition. Torval and Dean, who won the gold medal at the 1984 Olympics in Sarajevo. This is in ice dance. This is a piece called Bolero. And the first 30 seconds of their routine was just them on their knees, very lyrically moving their arms to Ravel's Bolero. And it was an exquisite moment. It was just, you know, again, one of those moments that just takes your breath away in its beauty. And so I shot a number of images, you know, of that scene, and this was one of those. And to me, it really kind of captured their partnership and the poetry of their movement. And this is how it was used. This was I was working for Newsweek magazine at the time through an agency that I was affiliated with at that time called Duomo Photography, and this was how Newsweek ran it. That was a very big deal to me at the time. I think I was 24 years old, and covering that Olympics was very, very exciting, very exciting time. Venus Williams, this is at Wimbledon, I think in 2007. To me, this image is all about tenacity. She's slipped on the grass, but she's somehow managing to stay in the point. Her eyes, again, are intently focused on the ball. I don't believe she made the shot, but she refused to give up. And that, again, that is a quality you see in athletics and sports all the time, is that kind of tenacity, always digging in, always realizing that you can still create in the moment. That if you are truly present in the moment, there's usually almost always something you can still do or try to do. And you see that in sports and athletics all the time, that it is all about being in the moment. I took this picture when I was 18 years old. This is a legendary basketball court in New York City called The Cage, which is famous for its street basketball. And I spent some time there, and I always had this sense of the youths that would play there. They were always sort of striving to push their boundaries, to achieve more, to go to new heights. And so I was trying to create a picture that spoke to that. And to me, this image was always about trying to transcend, trying to reach for a goal. Obviously it's a rebound, but you'll notice too, there's a similarity between these images, the different sports, similar body movements, you know, full extension. And again, this is a pattern you'll see over and over again in sports. There's always that kind of extension, that kind of reaching, you know. Freestyle skiing, this is in Lake Placid a number of years ago. Again, he's inverted, similar to that gymnastics photograph. And again, body fully extended, even in its inversion. So a lot of similarities between these three images in certain ways. And here, beach volleyball, the London Olympics, full extension of the bodies. And you'll find as you photograph sports, if you look for that kind of extension, you'll tend to be able to create, you know, somewhat dramatic images. Serena Williams at the London Olympics in 2012, and a few years later at the US Open. I think this is in 2018. What's amazing to me is these images are about 6 years apart, but the body movement is nearly identical. You know, which really speaks to the physical patterning, the muscle memory that goes into athletes performing at that level. Very different kind of image. This is her sister, Venus Williams, again. This is at the US Open. And again, there's sometimes a real loneliness to sports and athletes, even though they perform in the spotlight all the time. There can be a sadness to them, I sometimes find. And the way the light was just falling on Venus's face as she was preparing to serve, to me spoke to this, and so I was really trying to kind of capture that sort of sensibility, that feeling, the discipline of it, the loneliness of it, And very different kind of image, Rafa Nadal, obviously always known for his intensity. And here, this is at the US Open, really using the quality of the light to accentuate this notion of intensity. Were this picture taken on an overcast day, it would have far less potency, far less vibrancy, but full sun, really brings out both the colors, brings out his facial tones, and brings out the intensity. So that was some of the thinking going into this photograph. Novak Djokovic, one of his arch rivals. Again, reactions are a big part of sports, as athletes either win or lose, express either joy or frustration. That's often where you can get some of your most emotionally revealing images. And obviously Djokovic, either, not sure if he made the point here, I think he missed it, he was upset. And here, using a very long telephoto lens, notice the background is all blown out because you're shooting at a wide aperture to obliterate the background, and that makes your subject pop out a bit more. Or the background noisy, this image would have far less impact, obviously. London Olympics, Mo Farah winning the 10,000 meter. Again, we talked a little bit about athletes and their eyes and being a tell. You could tell going into this final lap, you could see the intensity in his eyes and his face, and you knew that he was about to give it an extra spurt of energy after having run most of the race already. And that look, cued me that, okay, this is about to get more intense, and we'll likely be able to get some wonderful pictures out of it. So this is him going into the final lap, or probably actually not the final lap. I think it's heading towards the finish line. And but again, the eyes tell the story, as do the other runners in the crowd, out of focus in the background. That gives it some sense of place and context. Michael Jordan, always known for his own brand of intensity and being able to suspend reality often. So this is a dunk. This is while playing against the Knicks sometime in the 1980s at Madison Square Garden. This was also shot on film in an indoor setting, a color negative film converted to a transparency, and here scanned. Jordan was famous for both his athletic ability and his ability to almost suspend reality in terms of the heights that he was able to leap, the way he would fly over defenders. It almost would feel, when you watch him up close, it would really feel like he had this ability to just make time stand still. Everyone else was flat-footed, and he was just creating in the moment from another place entirely. It was really quite remarkable, extraordinary to see. This is another image of him going up for a layup. Just notice the height of his jump. John Starks, who's his defender, is probably about 6'1" or 6'2", I would guess, maybe 6'3". And just look how far off the ground Jordan is, and how perfectly still his upper body is as he's focused intently on his goal, which is get the ball in the basket. I remember when I was photographing him, he was, athletes are hyper aware. They're aware of almost everything that goes on in the court. And I was sitting down in the court below the basket photographing, and he put some move on the defender right in front of me and faded away, sunk the short jump shot. And as he was coming down to earth, he looked at me and he sort of winked and he said, "Did you get that now?" And it was kind of a very sweet moment, but it was also very telling, because you tend to think they're not necessarily aware of other things going on in the crowd, with the press, whatever, but they're hyper aware of everything that's happening. Athletes have extraordinary abilities of focus and concentration, and if you watch professional sports up close, you will see that. Men's 100 meter at the London Olympics in 2012. The 100 meter is it's the premier event at any Summer Olympics. It is an extraordinary moment, because just at the start of the race, it doesn't matter if there are 80,000 fans in the stadium, you can literally hear a pin drop. It is dead silent. And once the gun goes off, as much as the runners are running with all their intensity, you can also feel the crowd participating in the moment. You can feel the energy, you can hear the gasps, and every single person in that stadium is with those runners in that moment. So I was really trying to think about how to make a picture that would convey the crowd was an equal participant in this moment. And usually when you photograph a track meet sprint, you have some choices. You can focus on the start, you can focus on the middle of the race, you can focus on the finish line, you can shoot from overhead. But I really wanted to kind of come up with a framing that, while I may not get the penultimate picture of him crossing the tape, I would get this other image, at the moment when he started to pull away, you'd feel the crowd's presence through the image. And with the Olympic rings, you obviously have a sense of where it was. So that was the choice I made. When we would cover things like this at say, Sports Illustrated, when I was there, we'd have a very different approach. You might have 10 photographers on the 100 meter. And some of your job as an editor is to think about where to place them. Sports Illustrated was a very demanding environment. So when you went to show photographs to your editors, they expected that you had every single moment from every single different angle, in case something extraordinary occurred. So, in approaching this, say, when I was at Sports Illustrated, which was not the case here, but say at the Atlanta Olympics, where I was editing for Sports Illustrated, you would position photographers in different places. You'd have one photographer or two photographers on the start. You'd have a photographer or two photographers on the infield. You'd have several photographers along the 100 meters on the crowd side. And you'd have, at least 3 or 4 photographers at the finish line, all with different lenses, different framings. You'd have a photographer in an elevated position shooting down. And you'd also have a series of remote cameras along the finish line on the side, several different lens choices at the looking head on the finish. And the idea was you wanted to be able to show your editors, 20 different versions of what occurred in that 10 seconds. But that was very much the ethos in planning coverage at Sports Illustrated. No matter whether it was an Olympics or a baseball game, we would always be thinking about multiple angles. Obviously, in sports, where you place yourself in relation to the action is a huge determinant of what kind of image that you will get. The choice I made here as an individual photographer, really making a composition choice in line with my own aesthetic is different than what I might do as an editor or on assignment for a publication. I might be following a much stricter set of guidelines there. This is a Little League baseball player in Tokyo, in Japan, in the mid-1980s. I've always liked this image. I was wandering around Tokyo taking pictures, and I happened upon these youngsters playing, and this young boy in particular, this pitcher, and he had such a sincerity about him. And there was this quality of perfect stillness when he reached the peak, when he reached the start of his windup. And I was very taken by it. And there's also a quality of held energy. It's literally that moment before the action is about to unfold. So the energy is pulled inward, and you will, again, this is a pattern you'll see time and time again in sports. There's a tension at the beginning of movement. And so here he's pulling the energy in. He's about to go into his windup. And I just love that quality of held energy. And this pattern, tension, release, reaction, tension, release, reaction. You'll see it over and over again in sports, played out in different ways. Here, it's a pitcher going into his windup. In basketball, it could be a defender watching a point guard bring up the ball. He's on his toes. In tennis, it's somebody waiting, receiving serve. Again, in baseball, it might be the runner on first base waiting to steal second base. The energy is all coiled. It's held, and in a moment, it will unleash. It will be released, and you'll get a different kind of picture that has more to do about movement and intensity and trying to execute action. And then, depending upon what happens, there is a reaction. He makes the shot, he exults. They lose the game, they're dejected. So tension, release, reaction, tension, release, reaction. That is a script one can use in approaching how to photograph sports, because you will get different kinds of visuals in those different moments. This is not an athlete. This is a woman named Maya Lin, who designed the Vietnam War Memorial and is, has a lot of fame as an architect and as a designer. In 1989, I spent about a year photographing her and her work. The reason I include this image in this talk and a few subsequent images is because I've always found there's a very similar level of concentration and focus and energy between artists and athletes. They're both, intently focused. And actually, if you look at these two images, there's a certain similarity to them. Here, he is pulling his energy in, about to go into his windup. Here, the artist is looking at the fabrication of a work that she designed and created. And she's literally feeling the stone and feeling the energy of the moment. So I see a lot of parallels between these images and these kinds of moments, and I've always been struck by that. That's why this is here, and this is Maya in her studio looking at some designs, similar in my mind to athletes reviewing their plans for their match or for their game, for how they're going to execute. This is also from the same story and same body of work. This is a topiary installation of the Charlotte Coliseum called Topo, which was actually the artist's first large landscape installation. And what they did was they brought these giant bushes, that were arranged on this whole stretch going up to the Charlotte Coliseum. And it was a very long day because all these things had to be transported, and they were brought into place and they were planted. And this was at the very end of the day, and I think this may have been the last one being planted. And you'll notice I was watching Maya as she was overseeing this work, and at one point her head just bowed down, and there was sort of a reverence to it. And it just struck me on an energy level. I was very taken by this sensation of the head bowed. And as a photographer, you're always taking mental notes. I believe that you're always internalizing from your experiences, and that is then reflected in subsequent projects and subsequent assignments and subsequent images. So that moment of that head bow always stayed with me. And this was probably in 1990 or 1991. And then a few years later, I was on assignment for the New York Times Magazine, working on a story about Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras, and lo and behold, I produced this image. And again, I can see a certain visual lineage, between the head bow here and the head bow here. How this came about is actually also kind of a fun and interesting story. The story the Times had asked me to do was about both Agassi and Sampras, which was a great rivalry in tennis in the mid-1990s. very different styles of play. Andre Agassi, known for all his flash, just do it, and Pete Sampras, a more physical, languorous, in the body style of play. So I was photographing them over a period of 6 weeks at different tournaments, and the magazine very much wanted to get both players to pose together, and the issue was neither one wanted to make a concession to the other's schedule. So every week we'd fly to another city, and my editor kept telling me, no, we're definitely going to get this, they're definitely going to pose. And finally, after 6 weeks on the road, we got to Cincinnati, and we were told that no, they won't pose together, but they will pose within 20 minutes of each other. So we need you to set up a studio and have two sets ready to go, one against black, one against white, and we're going to marry the two images so it looks like we shot them together. So I said, okay, great. And so we set everything up. We're waiting for them to come up, and an hour before the shoot was supposed to happen, I got a phone call from my editor, and she said, Adam, we've changed our concept altogether. We no longer want you to photograph their faces. We just want to see their wonderful arms, the sinewy muscles of their arms holding the tennis racket. And we're going to do this layout. We're going to do one arm of Pete Sampras holding the racket, one arm of Andre Agassi holding the racket, and that'll be our opener. And so really we just needed to photograph their arms and have them take off their shirts. And I couldn't believe it that we'd spent 6 weeks working on this, and all of a sudden I was supposed to photograph not their bodies or their faces, but just their arms. And I didn't say what I thought of the idea because I was on assignment, and sometimes you just have to follow orders. So Pete comes in for the shoot, and this is what we'd like me to do. And I said, well, let's just try a couple of shots this way. And I said, you know what, Pete, the magazine would really like me to photograph your arm holding your racket out. He gives me this look like, this is really stupid, and I'm not sure I want to do this. And so I say, okay, good, please, can we just try some? Just take off your shirt. So he holds out his arm, and I'm photographing his arm holding the tennis racket, which doesn't look very interesting. It just looks like an arm holding a tennis racket. And, but it's very physically demanding, just hold your arm out with the racket. So after 10 minutes of doing this, he just said, this is really tiring. And he put his head down on the racket and rested it. And again, this almost reverent pose. And my assistant and I looked at each other, we looked at Pete, we said, stop, freeze, hold that pose. And so that's how this image came into being. And in the end, the magazine was happy with it. This is how they ran the two images, the idea being trying to contrast the two personalities and their styles. Again, London Olympics, another sort of head down sort of image. I for some reason, this pose, always strikes me. And this is Ryan Lochte after a disappointing race. And just for an instant, he kind of bowed his head. The water's dripping off his chin. You could tell he was disappointed with his performance that day. Jessica Ennis, who was the heptathlon gold medalist in the London Olympics, British athlete. And this is actually before the competition started, and she was just practicing the feel and the weight of the javelin. And she was sort of in her own private headspace at the time. And I was backed off. I was I felt very kind of tuned into where she was mentally and psychologically. And that was, some of what this image was about. Again, athletes, have to go into a certain headspace, which can almost be trance-like at times. And, in those moments, you can often get some very interesting kinds of images. Back at Wimbledon in the 1980s, Jimmy Connors during a semifinal match against Bjorn Borg, which he lost. And this is, I think, the moment when he realized that he just didn't have it that day. And just sort of collapsed on the racket. And it's interesting to note the visual lineage between this picture, the Pete Sampras picture, all the head bow images, whatnot. There seems to be a recurring theme there. Okay, this is at the New York Times. This was actually one of the first digital images transmitted at the New York Times. I was the sports picture editor at the time. I took over the job just before the start of the Barcelona Olympics. And sports, because of its very fast deadlines and need to turn around, copy and images very quickly, was the guinea pig for all things digital. So we became the test case for how you would transmit digital images. This picture was shot on color negative film, was processed very quickly, scanned, transmitted to New York, scanned, opened in Photoshop, compressed to a JPEG, sent over a phone line. It took, I think, 3 minutes for the image to be sent, which was an extraordinarily fast time for that time. And so all of a sudden, newspapers like the New York Times realized, wow, we can get pictures into the paper within minutes of an event starting. In this case, this is Jackie Joyner-Kersee, who was a gold medalist in the heptathlon, and she's getting ready to throw the javelin. And the photographer, Barton Silverman, was a legendary Times and sports photographer, took this image and he called me up. I said, I've got this picture. It's very different. It's not really an action image. But you have the sense of the lone gladiator in the stadium. And he sent the picture, and I loved the image. There was a lot of controversy around this picture at the Times. One of the issues was that it was not a traditional action picture, and why were we running it? And I felt that it spoke to sports on a more kind of primitive, atavistic level. The other issue had to do with that it was an African-American woman holding a javelin, which seemed like a spear, and there were all sorts of racial undertones that people read into the image. It turned out that this image generated more comments than many, many photographs at the Times at the time. And so in the end, I believe it was a good choice to run it because it really sort of spoke to people. People found it very evocative again, on this sort of very primitive, atavistic level. But this was, again, in the technology of the day, this was a huge leap forward. And this was, one of the first digital transmitted pictures for the New York Times. This is at Sports Illustrated. This picture is not by me, it's by a photographer named Bill Frakes. This is Marion Jones, who was a track and field athlete and expected to win a lot of gold medals for the Sydney Olympics in 2000. And we were working on the Olympic preview issue, and we were trying to come up with a concept for how would we photograph Marion. And at a magazine like Sports Illustrated, we had a lot of latitude to experiment creatively. We had reasonably large budgets. We had, 18 photographers under contract who were some of the best photographers in the world. And so we could afford to play. And we would spend a lot of time trying to think up ideas and concepts. I was essentially hired at Sports Illustrated to be the deputy picture editor for feature photography, because feature images tended to get short shrift because they would be secondary to covering the news week in, week out. So I was really brought in to help manage those processes and help work on longer term projects and concepts. So this was for an Olympic preview issue. And I had the notion, well, what if we were to photograph her running on air? Just as if she's, Mercury, the god of speed. And everybody sort of liked this idea. And then we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to do this? And so she was at a track meet, and it was in North Carolina, and there were some woods not far. And so we rented a large trampoline, which is not in camera in the shot. And we had her and we set up some lights, some strobes, and we had her just practice starts off the trampoline, so that in camera, you would just see her suspended in air. There'd be no apparent ground under her. And so that's how this image was produced. But those were the kinds of things that we could do and often did do at Sports Illustrated. Kind of think creatively. Sports Illustrated was also very interesting in another way too. We talk a bit about technology. Technology has always been very integrated with sports photography. I mean, if you go back to some of the earliest sports images, Edward Muybridge and the locomotion studies that he did with horses and humans, you know, where he set up a battery of 16 cameras that demonstrated that horses, when they galloped, all four hooves left the ground, which was not settled fact until then, but he demonstrated photographically that it was the case, and he did that by rigging 16 cameras together that were tripped, one right after another, that showed the full stride of a horse in motion. That's the principle behind what became, you know, eventually what became motor drive cameras, that you would shoot images in sequence, the motor drive would advance the film, and even to modern day digital cameras that shoot 20 frames per second. That ability to shoot in sequence is a big part of things in terms of making sports images. And at Sports Illustrated, there was a legacy of technological innovation. So whether we were working with camera technology or working with strobe technology, we had license to do a number of things. We did some wonderful projects with 3D photography at Sports Illustrated, for example. We did a lot of work with stroboscopic effects. So it was a wonderful place to play, both creatively and technologically. Shifting gears a little bit now, this is 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. That's an American speed skater named Shawnee Davis. Again, a lot of visual connectivity in terms of these two images. Different sports, different personalities, very similar movements. This is my image in this case. Also from the London Olympics, this is a French heptathlete about to throw the javelin, and a very different image than the one of Jackie Joyner-Kersee, where she's preparing to throw. This is actually in the motion of throwing it. Again, long telephoto lens blows the background out of focus, separates the figure. Ski jumping, Lake Placid. Ski jumping is one of the most amazing things to watch because they literally look like they're flying off the mountain. In this case, I wanted to just convey some of the speed and of their flight, and the yellow jumpsuit against the black forest and black trees, you know, help make that image. This case, it's a slow shutter speed because I wanted some motion and some movement in the image. If you were freezing it for pure documentation, you probably should use a faster shutter speed so the subject would be sharp. We talked about where you place yourself in relation to the action. This is the start of the New York City Marathon sometime in the 1980s. This is taken from one of the towers of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, which is what the bridge is about 2.2 miles long. They run over it at the start of the race. And you know, when you're on the tower looking down at the athletes, you're literally hanging off the edge of the tower, lying on your stomach, and you can feel the bridge vibrating as, you know, 16,000 runners move their feet up and down, up and down, up and down. I was lucky that a sailboat passed by at that particular moment, which I think helped give the image a little more depth. America's Cup, 1983. This is an American boat, which is red, called America, and against the Australians, John Bertrand against Dennis Conner. This was the year the Australians finally won the Americans finally lost the America's Cup. And this is the final race. And again, this was, vantage point is important. This was taken from a fixed wing aircraft at about 1,000 feet looking down on the race course. And you can see how the boats are tacking, and you can see the wake of the boats and their angle in relation to each other. Shooting from planes is difficult. Planes are helicopters, but often in certain kinds of sports and instances that will get you into a position that you otherwise wouldn't be able to. Nowadays, I guess we might use drones, but at that time those didn't exist. So we would go up, go up in the airplane. Down. London Olympics, two American swimmers, Michael Phelps in the far lane, Ryan Lochte. And this is at the start of the breaststroke where they're entirely underwater, and the water has not yet been disturbed. So you can literally shoot through the water and you have a clear view of their bodies, slightly distorted by the undulating water, but the the surface of the water hasn't been broken yet, so they still look human. So this was kind of an interesting image. Again, back in the New York Times, this was also one of the early digital transmissions. The Chinese divers were favored to do well in Barcelona at the Olympics, and this was off the diving platform, and you could see the entire city of Barcelona in the background. So this was an image that a lot of photographers made. This was Martin Silverman's version of it. The newsprint's a little old, so you can't really see the background that clearly, but this image was, again, for its time, a big deal, both in terms of the technology which made its transmission possible, and also the style of images, which was a little different for a sports image at that time. Vancouver Olympics is US figure skater Mirai Nagasu. And again, I see a lot of visual connection between these images in different ways, you know, in terms of body position, line, whatnot. Simona Halep, Romanian tennis player, again, using the light for effect in terms of her intensity level as she sets up a forehand. Light is one of the, obviously one of the most emotionally evocative tools that a photographer has in their arsenal. And a lot of times when you're covering a sporting event, you will wait for that moment late in the day when the sun is very low, and you will get much more drama to your images. So a Canadian figure skater named Christina Nesbitt at the Vancouver Olympics. And it's not figure skating, speed skater. Speed skating is an enormously fast sport. And the power in their thighs and their legs is just, it's just incredible. And here she's, you know, generating that power on a turn, coming right towards the camera. And again, the eyes, you know, sort of pop out there. Judo, I think this is at the London Olympics. Judo is one of those sports where it just looks like they're holding on to each other. They're holding on to each other's gis and not much is happening. And then all of a sudden in an instant, you know, people are inverted or flipped over and everything changes. So the contortions of the body here were kind of interesting to me visually. All right, back at Sports Illustrated, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of what we could do and would do there. This was a, Sports Illustrated had a circulation of about 3 million readers. And oftentimes the kinds of images we would produce for feature stories needed to be over the top, impactful, or you know, really eye-catching in certain ways. This was a story about a linebacker for Ohio State in American college football named Andy Katzenmoyer, who was famous for hitting people. He not overly aggressively, but just his style of play. He would hit people very hard, and it was noted that, you know, people would often either get knocked out or their helmets would get knocked off or what. So we were trying to think of how to, you know, convey this about him, and I came up with this idea. Like, okay, well, wouldn't it be interesting if, you know, we photographed him like it was this old, almost like a World War I battlefield with mist in the background and bodies flying everywhere, and he's emerging out of this, and there's total destruction in the background. So everybody liked that idea, and they thought it was kind of cool. And then, of course, we had to figure out how to go do it. So we rented a number of crash test dummies. And the figures you see in the background are not actual athletes, they are crash test dummies. We rented a referee's uniform and football uniforms, and we got an AstroTurf mat built to represent the field. We had a backdrop painting that looked like fans in the background, and we brought in smoke and mist machines. And this all sounded great setting it up. This picture was taken by Brian Lanker, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner and an extraordinary photographer. This idea all sounded great until I got to the shoot, and all I found was that nothing had been set up, and I had crates of naked crash test dummies, and we had our subject arriving in 2 hours, and nothing had been set up. So myself and a few other people worked furiously the next few hours to get the crash test dummies dressed. We strung up the ref on a piece of nylon wire. We worked out the lighting. We worked out the smoke and the mist and the backdrop, and we shredded his uniform, and lo and behold, this was the image we produced. But that was the kind of thing you might do for Sports Illustrated to, you know, create a kind of image that was a little campy and a little silly, but it caught people's attention at the time. This was another type of feature story at Sports Illustrated about a basketball player at Stanford named Jimla Weideman. Her father was an author named John Edgar Weideman, and it was really a story about family secrets. His brother had been involved in something untoward, and it was really about this idea of sort of dark family secrets and stepping into the light and carrying a family legacy and whatnot. So we spent a lot of time really thinking, like, how would you illustrate this? And so we came up with this idea of father and daughter lighting it in such a way that spoke to this this idea of darkness and light. And this was the opener. And we knew that we wanted to use the term out of the shadows. And so John Burgess, who photographed this story, really scouted a location in one of the gyms at Stanford where we would, at a certain time of day, we'd get this kind of effect. But we would spend a lot of time at SI and at the Times, at the magazine when I was there, really thinking through how to illustrate certain kinds of stories and editorial themes. And those are really fun collaborations where you get to work with a writer and an art director and a photographer and really kind of put your heads together to think about how to come up with certain things. This picture by Walter Yost Jr., who's probably the greatest sports photographer of all time. This was a story for Sports Illustrated on the basketball player Kevin Garnett. And the idea was to really show off, you know, his athletic agility and his prowess and whatnot. And so Walter had the idea that, you know, to just rent a studio with a large cyc wall, which is a curved white wall. It's usually used to photograph cars. And he said, we're just going to light it and let Kevin go to town and let him do whatever moves he wants to do in front of the camera. And he produced this incredible shoot. And this is just one image from it, but of just a body in pure motion in this very silvery black and white, very high contrast, high key lighting. And this was the image that ran as the opener in Sports Illustrated. But he just let the athlete do his thing, and this is one of the images that came, you know, that came out of it, which ultimately ran as the opener for the story and is somewhat well known in sports circles. But I wanted to show you some of what we could do there at SI because it you know, gives you some feel for some of the different themes one might illustrate in sports. This is a very different kind of Sports Illustrated shoot. This is Dean Smith, who was a legendary basketball coach in North Carolina. The magazine was naming him Sportsman of the Year, and at Sports Illustrated, that was a very big honor. And so we tended to need to produce images that were very iconic. And this picture was taken by Michael O'Neill, who's a portrait photographer in New York. And the idea was to create an image that spoke to this legacy and his stature as this great sportsman. Very different kind of image here. This is a outrigger canoe race actually on the Hudson River. And outrigger canoe is one of those sports where everyone needs to paddle in nearly complete unison. And so I really wanted to kind of get at some of that. So by working against the light, by not shooting with the light behind me, but rather shooting directly into the reflection coming off the water, I was able to kind of create this silhouette and this, you know, very dramatic human form. This image speaks to teamwork. Obviously, that's another big theme in sports. We talked about the loneliness of the athletic journey. Again, this is a diver in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Lens choice here is to go wide, not with a long telephoto lens, but rather a wide angle lens to just show her as this single lone figure against this much larger backdrop. And silhouetting it just allows you to accentuate the form. Similar idea, this is a US figure skater named Rosalind Sumner. This is at a figure skating meet in Japan sometime, I think, in the 1980s. But again, by shooting into the light, by shooting into the reflection, you can accentuate the human form. Another view of an image we looked at earlier. This is a rider in the rain on the track, and again, I just like the ugliness of the weather and that notion of, you know, day in, day out, regardless of the conditions, they're out there practicing and riding. And I like the way the hoof marks sort of trailed off into the background. You know, perspective, leading lines, using lines to guide the viewer's eye, you know, is a big part of composition. So that's one element that's employed here with both the rail and the hoof marks. General view, you know, we looked at originally the celebration picture of Borg from the 1980 Wimbledon final. This is a general view of that match, showing him and McEnroe battling it out on center court, and the drama in the sky seems to match the drama of the match. So this image at the time ran in a lot of places, it ran very large because it was considered such a historic match. London Marathon, sense of place, not London, the marathon during the London Olympics, rather, in 2012, and you can't say London any better than the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben, so this seemed like a somewhat obvious picture, but it was still kind of fun to take. Motion, speed, explosiveness. This is at the Velodrome during the London Olympics as well. Here, working with a very slow shutter speed to, again, convey a sense of motion, and a wide angle lens to bring us, you know, give us a whole feel for the whole perspective of the Velodrome. Similar idea, American football, motion on the line. Usually you see pictures of quarterbacks or running backs. I really wanted to look at all of the movement on the line when you know, defenders and offensive linemen are sort of battling for turf. And I thought with a slow shutter speed, you get a feeling for some of that kind of movement and motion. Kayak sprints during the London Olympics. It's a furious sprint and paddles are flying and water is flying in every direction. And by using a telephoto lens, again, you compress one set of paddlers on top of another, and you kind of create that effect, that stacking effect. Moment of celebration, Yannick Noah at the 1983 French Open, I believe. This is during the final or the semi-final. He eventually won the tournament. It was a big story in France at the time. But again, those reaction moments will tend to be where you'll get a lot of your intensity in your images. Pageantry is a huge part of sports at any level. But this is the start of the London Olympics, the British team marching into the stadium, which was obviously a big deal to the British, and confetti flying and the Union Jack and whatnot. And the Olympic flame, which is, for all the problems the Olympics have, I always find emotionally stirring and riveting, and I'm somewhat idealistic that way. I always sort of fall for the idealistic quality of these symbols. But this is the Olympic flame, and using the heat generated from the flame to create that mottled effect of the crowd. So, okay, and so that is all I've got for you in terms of images. Let me,
Oh, thank you, Matan.
my pleasure.
Do you have any questions? I see some people left, you know, I know people are working, and we're going to have a recording of this.
Sure.
Anyone here? Haraldur, Þorsteinn, Jóhann, Silja, Ragnar, Eva Björk, Sunneva, Vilhelm, Torfi, Veri, einhverjar spurningar til Adams? A chatbox hérna niðri sem þið smelt á. Ég hef ekki séð neina spurningar. Maybe you know, they're shy. Maybe, I don't know. But Adam, I'd like to ask you a question.
Sure.
Now, I think it's, am I right, or is there some sense in it that, you know, when you are in both in sport photography and in just general photojournalism, there is like a three maybe main groups or main let's say groups or approaches. One is like this one you have here of the Olympic fire. It's a expression photo. It sort of is a photo that is not, it is sort of a, it's expressing. So it's a close photo, limited to something related to the main event, but it doesn't sort of, I mean, it could be, let's say we have a demonstration, it could be a kid, baby in a cradle, you know, and there's someone pushing it in there, and you know, it's like, or just sort of those sort of close emotional. Then you have the, I would call that close-up shot, and then you have the medium shot that sort of is showing, you know, an action, you know, a skate runner or a ballet skate or whatever. And then you have this third category, which is basically like an overview over the event.
Yeah, and I think I'm not sure this is your question, but yes, you have to think in terms of that kind of coverage. You have to think of a general scene that captures the overview. You have to think of singular images of the personalities. You have to think of the image of the action, and you have to think of images that reflect the spirit of the event.
Right. Yeah.
So that's very true, and it's almost like a filmmaking sort of look approach to it. You know, you think about your shot coverage and your shot mixture, your shot selection, but that's very true.
And especially in where you have the sort of medium shots, that then you have to be, you have to see, you have to think a bit ahead of what's happening, don't you?
Yes.
You have to try to
You have to, anticipation is a large part of sports coverage, and you have to think in terms of how the action is likely to unfold. Obviously, you don't know what's going to happen, and there are always surprises, but you have to think a lot in terms of what you think will happen, and what the line may be, and what may be the winning catch or point or whatnot. But obviously a big part of it.
And if there's a, you know, if there's an empty moment and you have a zoom lens, then you can maybe zoom into someone's feelings, or even, you know, even just pulling up his sock or showing some facial expression, you know, although he's not in the middle of the game. You know, it's like, it's connecting with the.
Yes. Yeah, connecting with the emotion of the moment.
Right. Yeah. And that does not have to always be the middle of the moment, the action. It can be also.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, anybody have any questions? Or
there's one here. How long do you feel it took you to master the art of sports photography?
Well, I'm not sure I would put a time frame on it. You know, I was always attracted to it, and obviously the more I did it, I got better at it.
Yeah.
You know, I think one is always mastering and one is always refining.
Yeah.
You know,
you learn as long as you live.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been doing it for 30 some odd years. So
yeah.
Oh,
and we have one there who wants to come and thank you for a great course. Is it possible to come to the United States and attend a course with you?
Sure. Anytime. I mean, if I'm teaching somewhere, and I do teach in different places, absolutely. You can always drop me an email, and I'd be happy to, you know, have you classes. Sure.
Right. I have this notion that, you know, I think it's not, maybe it was more in Iceland before than in other places in the world. You know, you could get quite well paid if you got a front image on a New York Times, or if you could get a front image on Le Figaro or things like that. But that's no longer the story, you know. And I assume that the Icelandic photojournalists, you know, they are not sort of I don't think they're envied by the salary they have. But still, there is this. I think it's. I'm all right. You need to go. You need to work, and you need to think. What are you gonna? What are you going? Where are you going? What are you gonna photograph?
Yeah.
And why? And you have to sort of not just shoot something like you have a AK-47. You have to sort of try to see expressive angle. Am I right? You know.
Yeah, you can't rely on the tools and the technology. I mean, they're there to support you, but you have to have your own vision of what it is you want to communicate. And that may change in the moment, but you have to really think through what it is you're trying to say about a particular event or about a particular athlete.
Yeah.
The extent to which you can do that, you know, will give you a leg up in terms of producing images.
And that's, you know, that can be even be, you know, when they're practicing or when they're after the game and they lost or whatever, you know, it's or whatever, you know, it doesn't, it can be like an expression of the, or you know, they're all sweaty and tired and they're just, you know, they lost or whatever. It can be a emotional shot that maybe is not, you know, it's not the, well, you never know what becomes the best shot.
Yes,
until you
true. Very true.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, this has been a pleasure, and it's very nice to speak to this audience. And I'm so glad, Einar, we got to collaborate on something.
Finally, and maybe we're not finished.
Okay.
Instead of you people coming to you to New York for a seminar, maybe we can line up. You come over to Iceland and run a one-day seminar.
Oh, I'd love to.
So you know, nothing ventured, nothing gained. But let's wrap this up, and thank you so much, Adam, for doing this for us, and thank you all for attending. And I will send everyone a link of the recording, and maybe give me a day or two. And please, you know, if you want to attend those webinars like we do them all free, and the best way is to be on our post list.
Wonderful.
So thank you all. Thank you, Adam. Thank you all.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice day, and tuttuli-doo and honky-dory.
Okay. Sounds good.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Bye.